You're listening to Overdoing It, the Rhode Island Library podcast. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Overdoing It, where our team of library workers dish about their latest reads, views, and passions alongside fascinating conversations with local luminaries. I'm your host, Tayla, and I'm the branch librarian at the Oaklawn branch in Cranston, Rhode Island, and my pronouns are she, her. Let's dive in and discover who our guests are today.
My name is Josephine Ferorelli, and I am a writer, illustrator, and climate activist who lives in Chicago, Illinois. And I am also the co-founder, co-director of an organization called Conceivable Future with my fellow guest, Meghan Kallman. And we are together co-authors of a book called The Conceivable Future, Planning Families and Taking Action in the Age of Climate Change.
Hi there, and I am Meghan Kallman. I'm the other half of that equation, co-founder, co-director, and co-author of The Conceivable Future, the whole package. I'm also a professor and a state senator here in Rhode Island.
Fantastic. So a little bit later in the show, we will talk about your book and overall the project, The Conceivable Future. But before we get into that, let's start off as we always do with what have you been reading?
So I actually read a lot of nonfiction for work. And so in my downtime, I am a huge fiction hound. And a couple of things. I did just read All Fours by Miranda July, which has kind of been making a splash nationally. And I revisited a book that I read for the first time 2 years ago called The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi by a woman named Shannon Chakraborty. And I also read Ross Gay's The Book of Delights, which was an utter delight. That is actually short essays. It's not fiction, but it was beautiful, every word of it.
And I just finished just a gem of a memoir called The Mourner's Bestiary, which is written by Erin Caffel, who's also a Chicago author. And she does a tremendous job of weaving together her personal experiences as a person with a disease called polycystic kidney disease, which shorthand PKD, which is something I didn't know much about until I learned from this book, and the climate crisis, and her relationship with her family, both her parents and her child. And I was lucky enough to be at her book launch event, and she was very funny, saying that the book sounds like it's going to be a stone cold bummer. And actually, my experience was it was full of all of her love, all of her hope, and all of her wonder at the natural world. And it's really a book about healing, which is so necessary and such a good thing to have on my bookshelf right now.
Fantastic. So I just read Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson. They wrote This Book is Gay. They also wrote another nonfiction book about the trans experience, but this was their first time writing fiction, and it's about witches like being secretly part of our world and like secretly part of the government, but they also have kind of like their own politics and all kinds of stuff. I really enjoyed it. But it was one of those books where you're like, we wrapped this up satisfactorily enough that everyone's like doing okay. And then like literally the last chapter, which was like only 3 or 4 pages long, was just like, blow that all up.
So sequel forthcoming.
Yeah, I'm very anxious to read the sequel. I think it might be a trilogy, so there might be one more. But the second one is out, and there's also like a prequel that's like a little bit shorter, bordering on novella, about how Anne Boleyn established the first kind of like official coven of England.
So you were enticed. You're going to go on the ride.
Yeah, I definitely was. There were parts of it that were intense, and I thought it was like a very interesting world. I always love when there's all this kind of like terminology and jargon in the world. So like, yeah, the fact that there were like different, what type of witch you were and like what level you were, and that there was like, that was like all built into this world, but also like not introduced to you in a way that was very didactic. Like it was introduced to you in a way that was like very natural to the story.
That's one of the things that I really loved about The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi, is that both the first time and also in the rereading, is that it's like got this really pedestrian attitude towards magic, which I think is partly what makes it feel really, really real.
I think both of us even later to the party than you are. I hadn't heard of that. But sometimes Meghan and I send back and forth just like very escapist fiction because life is hard.
Because that's healthy.
It's good to read. And one of the things that I've been really excited about and excited to share with her is the book's Mary Stuart, which is like, I think she was writing from like the 40s through the 80s. And her most famous book is the Merlin trilogy, which is like the Crystal Cave and the Hollow Hills. And I forget what the last one is called, or that might be 1 and 3. I don't know. But it focuses on the Arthurian saga through the lens of Merlin, and it's really wonderful. And it's very much what you're talking about, like all of those world building. I mean, this is maybe more like military history, but something about I just trusted her to not be like very, very dull about that. But her other books, for the most part, are these sort of smaller scale dramas about, to some extent, magic. Like there's magic in someone's family. There's also like a mystery, possibly a murder. There's usually like a very romantic setting, like Corsica or the English countryside. Yeah. And the plucky heroine is usually your guide through this mystery, through this world. So I think my favorite one of those is called Thornyhold, and it's about a woman figuring out what to do with the legacy of being the town witch that her aunt left her. But there's like a lot of different angles on this.
It's funny that you said about like being the town witch, because there was one part in Her Majesty's Royal Coven. So one of the characters basically like was not super jazzed about being a witch, like kind of just wanted to be normal. And so she married a non-magical man and thought she had 2 non-magical children until her daughter started manifesting her powers. She's like, okay, I'm going to make my daughter also keep this secret so that we can maintain the life that we've been having. And then like a bunch of stuff happens, and it basically comes to a point where she can't keep lying to her husband, and she looks right at him and she's like, do you remember how all the kids in the neighborhood used to say that my grandmother was a witch? And he was like, what? like that's how she decided to break it to her husband of like a decade plus. Like her children are like elementary and like teenage age, and she's just like, remember how everyone said that my grandmother was a witch?
Turns out they were onto something.
Yeah, it turns out they were 100% right, and that she's one of the most like powerful oracles, which are like the types of witches that could see the future, like in England.
This sounds very sweet. How's he take it?
I mean, a lot is happening. I can't remember if they necessarily on the page had a real like decompressing of all of it. Like in that moment, he was just kind of like, you have to be kidding. And she's like, no. But I also relate to what you guys are saying about escapist fiction. Like that's kind of why I picked this book. I was like, I need something that's like, I've been in kind of a reading rut, and I feel like I need something that just like is gonna move and be kind of like going into it being a slam dunk, you know what I mean? Like kind of going into it being like, I'm pretty sure I'm gonna really like this, and I kind of need to know from the jump that that's what this experience is gonna be.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's something really valuable about escapism, right? Partly because it allows us to free ourselves of the constraints of like our regular worlds enough to let our imaginations go, right? Like I think there's a value, sort of like a lowercase p political value in that, like just allowing ourselves to inhabit an imaginary world for a little while, because it gives us some insights into what our world might be, right? Our lived world might be. And also like rest and restoration is a valid goal unto itself in like reading or stories or music or TV or whatever otherwise.
For sure. So yeah, I think that leads us well into besides reading, have you been finding any rest and restoration in any TV or movies lately? What have you guys been watching?
Josephine should take this one first because she's a really avid and thoughtful movie watcher.
I also send Meghan my recommendations. I think I act as kind of a pre-screener for like, I think that, well, one thing that's that came out this week, I think, that I haven't watched yet is the second season of a show called The Diplomat. And the first season I really, really loved. I think Kerry Russell is fantastic, and I really like that she's been kind of a mainstay on television, of good television, like at different moments throughout my life. Like I was a middle schooler watching Felicity and I got a lot out of it. I have since rewatched it and it's like not exactly what I want it to be anymore, but I get why it met that need. And then The Americans, I think, is one of the greatest shows of all time. And she and Matthew Rhys are phenomenal in it. So now she's in this show where she plays she's supposed to be American diplomat to Afghanistan, and right at the last minute she gets rerouted to London because of some like machinations that are like outside of her awareness. It turns out she's being groomed as a possible replacement for the vice president. It's like so there's a lot of this. She's like a very serious person with a very specific set of skills and wants to do work that's about helping people and about crisis. And instead she's in a world of kind of images and like very, very like white glove diplomacy. And she's so frustrated, but so skilled at all of this stuff. I really like watching shows about people who are good at their job. That's like this weird through line of like, it took me a while to realize that that's what it was, but watch people be like competent and compassionate and smart, and also watching people have kind of like collegial relationships, because I feel like we know so much about people's like big messy romances and stuff like that, but just like the way we act with the people that we're around all the time, and those little intimacies with like people we work with and stuff like that. I feel like this show is really good at that and makes me feel kind of inspired about like sophisticated political thought at a time when I feel like sometimes political thought is like not as sophisticated as I would wish it to be. So I'm really excited to watch season 2, which is available now, as I understand it.
Well, mine is also along those lines. As Josephine insinuated, I don't watch a ton of television. And in fact, I didn't have a TV at any point in my life until like really recently. However, speaking of season 2s, there is a Netflix series, the English translation of which is The Law According to Lydia Poet, which is based on a true story. It's, Netflixified, of one of the first women lawyers practicing in Italy. And I think this is one of those moments where like watching shows about the same themes that I deal with in my regular life, but in a really, really different context, is inspiring and it's refreshing, right? And so there's all of this stuff about suffragism. There's all of this stuff about the freedom to practice. There's like, it is the most stylish show I've seen in a really long time too. Her outfits are just like unbelievable. And so it's just like this beautiful thing to watch. It's a pretty sanitary version, but there's a lot of like truth and grappling and what it means to, think about yourself as operating in a power structure that is designed not for you, but explicitly to keep you out. And again, watching that unfold in like, the 1870s in Italy is just different enough from my own context to be sort of enlivening rather than deadening, right? And I think one of the reasons why I often steer clear of shows either about the academy or about the political world is because I spend a lot of time in both of those places. And so getting inspiration from things that look different enough that I can sort of follow the threads and find the sweetness and the richness and the change in perspective. And for me, like there's a real value in having that happen in a context that's like very different from my own.
Yeah, I think I watched the first episode of that and I did like it. I don't know why I didn't go back.
The outfits just get better every successive episode and every successive season. The clothing is just better and better.
I watched the first half of the first season and I really liked it too. And I also think that often TV is not quite so episodic. Like contemporary American television, like will have more of a through arc. And it's not that show doesn't, but each one is its own mystery. So I feel like you can kind of watch an episode and be like, it's like you haven't picked up the sequel yet. It doesn't mean that you're like done with the show altogether. I enjoyed watching that too. So my father was Italian and I grew up speaking Italian at home, but in the 10 years after his death, I don't use it anymore. And it's just sitting there in my brain and it feels really nice to just just connect and hear it.
Once again, I feel like, I don't know, you guys all brought very like, I don't know, that yours all kind of like matched in tone a little bit. But the thing I watched most recently is I watched the Wedding Ringer, which is a movie from like almost 10 years ago now. It's 2015, I think it came out. And it was recommended to me by someone because I am currently planning a wedding.
Oh, congratulations.
Congrats.
Thank you. And they were like, this will allow you to kind of laugh at some of the craziness of the process, especially when it comes to like interpersonal relationships and like who to have in your wedding party. So the whole premise of the movie is Kevin Hart's character is the wedding ringer. So he's created this business to help men who do not have a close enough male friend to be their best man.
That's very tender.
Yeah, at moments the movie is like, yes, but then the movie is rated R. So Josh Gad plays the groom in this, and he has like no friends, and his bride-to-be has like 7 bridesmaids. So he comes to the wedding ringer and he's like, I need 7 groomsmen. And Kevin Hart's character is like, it's never been done before. But he had a name for it. He like all of his packages had names, and he's like, "You're calling for a golden ducks. It's never been done before." And Josh Gad's character is like, "But you have a name for it, though." But so it's this whole thing of trying to pull off this ruse that he knew these 7 guys like his whole life, and
very interesting statement on friendship. I haven't seen the movie, but it says some stuff that feels sad to me on the hearing of it.
It reminds me a little bit of this movie that I saw called The Breaker Uppers. It's about these 2 women who have a company where you can hire them to break up with your partner if you don't feel like it or want to. And I like this idea that people come up with these like little cottage industries to do like intimate things for hire because no one would even suspect that such a thing existed, you know? I did like that. I think if you're thinking about weddings, maybe it's not on topic, but it will make you laugh.
No, it still sounds like it would be a fun one.
Yeah.
But no, Megan, I agree that it was kind of like 10 years ago. So this is like pre-COVID's exacerbation of the loneliness pandemic and all of that. So yeah, it was kind of wild. And some of it like didn't age super well. Which is unfortunate to say from 10 years ago. Like I thought in 2015 we were doing this a little bit better, but like
things move really fast.
Yeah, they do.
Sometimes the homophobic father of the bride made me cringe a little bit. I was like, ugh.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. And it's just like, I've been accused of not having much of a sense of humor about stuff like this, but like, I don't know. I'm a sociologist by training and an organizer sort of in my orientation. And so when I hear like the conceit of a movie like that, I'm like, oh God, loneliness and men have way fewer friends than women on average and blah, blah, blah. And they've made this whole movie about like capitalizing on that friendship gap.
And it's not the only one either.
Yeah, totally.
There's another movie, I think it's called like I Love You Man or something. There's definitely a Jason Segel movie where he has to like make a male friend because his wedding's coming up and he just like doesn't have one. So I think that one's actually, as I remember, like quite sweet. But the same idea is like, what are you dudes doing? Like, where are your people? And how can you make those relationships more meaningful to you before you have to hire somebody?
Yeah. But now I'm actually curious to see it.
So I was gonna say warning there that it's rated R and that some parts of it are cringy because it was made like 10 years ago. But overall, it was over the top but fun, and did kind of have this kind of sweet premise at the center of like friendship and the importance of it and the importance of remembering why you want to help people. It was recommended to me because I was talking to that person about how I kind of felt sad that I didn't have like a gaggle of girlfriends to be around me on my wedding day. That I have a pretty like small friend group and will ultimately probably have a pretty small wedding party. Which I've come around to being happy with, but especially like when you're planning, so you're seeking out all of these like ideas. So you're looking at pictures of other people's weddings and you see these women surrounded by 4 or 5 other women. And seems like they're all having a great time. So it's interesting that you guys came from it from like the male like friendship gap perspective, which I don't think I mean, it makes sense to me, but I don't know if I've necessarily heard that before.
It's a thing, but I guess
Yeah.
this is like also kind of an interesting conversation to have with Josephine and I, because we're super close friends who are really differently oriented towards our relationships. And both of us have really, really like profound relationships. But I'm an extrovert and Josephine is not. And so our style of connection is super different. And we talk about that in our book, but also just kind of in life, is that like there's all sorts of valid ways to form the connections that we need. And that, you know, Instagram doesn't tell a complete story of any of those things.
For sure.
But certainly that there are some narratives that like, you know, are a little bit more elevated. And, you know, as far as we're concerned, like the thing is to figure out how we all connect to others in ways that make our hearts happy and, you know, fulfilled.
Yeah. And the data would show over and over again that like it is about the depth, not the breadth of connection. And that like if you have like one or two intimate friends, and that can be family members as well as other people, like that's what matters, not having like 10 people wearing the same outfit on a particular day. And on the flip side, like the image of stuff is something that's actually driving a lot of the mental health crisis. This idea that everyone's doing it a certain way and you're coming up short in every possible way. And that like, if you know, whether it's a destination wedding, whether it's a like, you know, 10-person bridal party, whatever, like you're always failing to measure up. And that's a gross feeling. It's also a harmful feeling, and it's not grounded in reality. So it's like you have a really interesting like crossroads between what seems and then what is, right? Like what do you need versus like what are you being told that you need?
Yeah, for sure. And my partner has, to the point sometimes where I've been somewhat annoyed by it, but it's coming from a good place that he very much is like, I want you to think about whether you genuinely want this, like for our wedding, or whether you think you should do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so like I guess that's like a good influence, I think, to have during the process. Even sometimes it drives me crazy because he'll be like, whatever you want to do. And I'm just like,
have an opinion.
But yeah, it is nice to have people around me who are reminding me, like, because my mom has been really good about it too, that she's like, keep what traditions feel good to you, throw out what traditions don't feel good to you. She's like, do what you want and have this be like an event that's very you.
I think that's the only way.
Yeah. So it's nice to have the people around me being like, it's okay.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, I think that is the only way to do it. And also, weddings are so supercharged with like a gazillion years of the patriarchy and people's expectations and this and that. It's like, it's a minefield to begin with.
Yeah, for sure. But we came here to talk about the minefield colored by the patriarchy and by the climate crisis that inspired your book, The Conceivable Future. So, for our audience who haven't checked out the book yet, can you just talk a little bit about the concept of the book?
For sure. So I like that we're talking about this in the context of a conversation about like our families, our friends, our the art and culture that we're consuming, because I feel like one of the big inspirations to write about the intersection of the climate crisis and people's reproductive lives and family planning was like that connection hadn't been made broadly like in the public discourse, but a lot of people were feeling it personally. So the book is about like climate crisis is now a major negative factor in people's family planning and in people's reproductive lives. And everybody who's of reproductive age and like somewhat aware of what's going on around them is like highly aware of this, right? That a hotter, less stable, more dangerous future is coming into our lives. And that makes these decisions about whether or not to become a parent, about how to parent a child, about how to strengthen our kinship relationships, all that stuff is like very present right now. So when we started organizing around this 10 years ago, this conversation was not happening at all. And we've been lucky to play a pretty big role in shaping that conversation as it's come into public view. Most of that was through organizing work on the we did house parties around the country. We organized group conversations about this stuff just to let people have a non-judgmental space to like think and feel in community about what the climate crisis means for our lives. But there was like a real limit to how deep those conversations could go in like 2 or 3 hours, without, without all of the data, without all of the science and the history and the politics that really shape this discourse on the macro level. So the book was like us trying to give people all of the tools that we have found to help think this stuff through and feel this stuff through, and also to feel less alone and more inspired to action.
And I think the conversation earlier about connection is important here. So Josephine and I met through a mutual friend. She, of all things, was performing music that she'd written on instruments that she built to accompany a physicist's lecture on dark matter. So that happened here in Providence exactly in November 2014. And I was here, as I always am. Josephine had come up from New York, where she was living at the time. We didn't know each other. And this woman, Jamie, kind of grabbed us both by the elbows. And she was like, you guys are both climate people. Like, you might want to talk. And so we had this like profound whispered conversation, like, right before this concert started. And the next weekend, Josephine got back on the bus and came back up, and we kind of sat by the wood stove and hammered out the blueprint for what would become the organization. But from the start, right, like what we connected about before the concert was the way that these sort of hopes and fears were intertwined in our own lives. It's kind of a weird thing to start talking about with someone you've never met. But I think both of us recognized two things in that conversation. One, that we weren't alone, and two, that the power of talking about it is incredibly generative and powerful. And so Conceivable Future, the organization, just, for years just consisted of us putting together house parties or sharing resources for having house parties that, were modeled on safe spaces for people to just talk about what was going on for them. And from the beginning, we have never, ever taken a position on what anyone should or shouldn't do, with their parenting life, with their reproductive life. That's not the point. The point is to talk about how this is a real feature of everyone's realities. And in doing that, put some words and some language and some history and some critique around the bad stuff that got us here. And so at the end of the day, right, like people were showing up in our house parties. They found us on social media. They found us all over the place with this tremendous feeling of guilt, and turning that inward and sort of like letting it was poisoning them or hurting them somehow from the inside. And so our goal has been always like, how do we sort of shift that guilt from inward focus to like looking at the systems that govern our lives and try to make those systems healthier, more just, more responsive, more, certainly more sustainable. And so by talking about this issue, which was and continues to weigh so heavily on like the hearts and minds of young people, part of the theory is that by seeing this as sort of a collective and structural problem, we start to look for collective and structural solutions rather than just sort of beating ourselves up over the fact of, being a person.
And I think one of the interesting things about the book is that you both kind of from the get-go are like, we're not going to this book is not going to provide you an answer of whether, you should or should not have a child in order to help the climate. One, because that's like too complicated of a question for us to answer. Seems like kind of like there's just so many different factors. It's not as easy as just like looking at population numbers or carbon or anything like that. But that you then go, okay, what we are going to do is tell you how you can start to mobilize in your own communities, and whether that's to, I hate to say offset, but whether that's like because you decided to have a child and want, a future for them that's more positive climate wise, or whether you didn't, like, here's the blueprint to do that.
Yeah. So we frame it as this idea of like, should I have a child, another child? Should I parent? Should I not parent? We call this an impossible question, the impossible question, because there's no right answer to an impossible question. The circumstances that make it impossible have people backed into a corner. And so we say that the only right answer to the impossible question is to work as hard as possible for a safe and habitable future for everybody's children, whether they're yours, mine, my colleagues, Josephine's, doesn't matter. That it's our jobs as the adults of the world to create the conditions for the next generation to thrive, period. And when we think about it that way, then we're able to shift this like weird blame of guilt and shame and fear and, inward focus, and think about it much more in terms of like, what is it that we need to do so that everybody's as okay as they can possibly be?
The thing that we understood through having these conversations was that like this immense focus on one's own carbon footprint, about your own consumption, and particularly about the carbon cost of having a child. So the guilt that people are feeling about, like, they want to have a kid, but they know having a kid is bad for the environment. That's how a lot of people feel. When you're only hearing it framed that way, and when you're obsessed about trying not to do harm, it gets in the way of asking the bigger question, which is like, why is it so carbon intensive to have a kid in this country in the first place? Why is it so carbon intensive just to live in this country in the first place? And doing or not doing the things that we do in this society is not changing the systems that force us to do it. So like, how do we change systems? And the answer is like, first of all, you can't do it alone. So the big thing, the number one thing, whatever the solutionary path you take looks like, is always find your people, get together. And that can be, like, to our conversation earlier, that can be one person. It's like Meghan and I have often talked about our work together as like a two-person change-making unit. And for me, two is immensely more powerful than one. Like, it's really like a power of multiplication. Like, we are able to do things together that neither of us could do alone. And also, in Meghan's life as a legislator, she does things in concert with other people all day, every day. And so like, there's this idea that like some people have more political power, they can make greater change. Political power is about being together with people. It is about working together. There is no like single leader that is going to fix things for anybody else. It's always together. And that can be hard to see because we focus so much on the individual. But a big theme in this book is like how we work together, what it looks like, and what it's for.
And how we move from that question of what can I do to what can we do, which first requires finding out who is we. And so I guess in that sense, like, the book is about reproduction and it's about climate, but it thinks about, reproduction kind of as a set of tools and a set of histories through which we understand both the challenges that we're facing and the things that we really value about the world and that are worth working really, really hard to save. So when we first started this project, we encountered a lot of misinformation and sort of misunderstandings, some of which I would say were purposeful misunderstandings. Specifically, we had to learn a lot about and like really confront the fallacies of the arguments for population control right out of the gate. And there was a lot of assumptions, again, I think willful in some cases, that like, because we were talking about both issues together, that it must be, this must be a book about population. And population control legacies are very, very ugly all over the world, right? They're linked to curtailing the human reproductive rights of countless groups of people who have been historically oppressed. I mean, as recently as 2017, there was a judge in California who was offering to shave time off of incarcerated people's sentences for undergoing a, quote, voluntary sterilization. So this like idea that like somehow you can control poverty, but by controlling the reproduction of poor or otherwise marginalized communities is not something anybody, I think, should want any part of. But also that, when emissions is linked to consumption, it's not linked to numbers of people, right? So to break it down a little bit, if everyone in the world consumed the way that like upper middle class or middle class Americans consumed, we need another like 4.5 to 6 Earths worth of stuff, right? So that's like a wasteful way to consume. And all these ideas about carrying capacity are like based on ideas or expectations or assumptions about the way the economy works, the way the world works, that are like not immutable. They don't have to be that way. Like, we can build better systems. I drive to work sometimes because the public transit stops after a certain point in the day, right? And therefore my carbon footprint is bigger because I'm driving. But also, if we had buses, right, like those things change. And so the idea here is that like population arguments are often, they're the paint job for usually a pretty classist and sexist and racist agenda, but also they're like not based on good science. So we found that we had to confront that. We found we had to, really sort of think through the legacies of women-led social movements and like really interrogate what that has looked like over the years, because it's looked like a lot of different ways, and sort of explore the role of gender, sex, reproduction in, women's continual sort of bids for political power, and our attempts to build power and our attempts to build capacity. And then we had to look at gender inclusivity in a world where that is not the standard sort of format, and grapple with what that means.
All right. So is there anything else that you all want our audience to know about the Conceivable Future before we wrap up?
Well, I will say the two things that we really want for readers is that if they read this book, we won't give them pat answers, but we hope that they will feel less alone and that they will feel empowered with like next right steps. And if we've given readers those two things, then we're really doing the work we set out to do.
And I definitely felt that way reading the book. Even though a little bit of it was like overwhelming, like the idea of organizing. But I remember very distinctly like being excited about reading the book. And then in the beginning, you guys being like, well, we're not going to tell you whether the right answer for the climate is to have a kid or not have a kid. And there was part of me that was a little bit like, oh, shucks, I wish someone could have just given me the answer. But like, then as you go through the book, like you guys have been saying, it kind of makes you feel like whatever decision you make, here is also some concrete things that you can do and feel good about.
And that, like with any luck, you feel a little less burdened by the feeling of like it is incredibly important to you personally, to me personally, like what is my family composition? What are my love relationships? But the idea that those things have this political weight and that you could make a wrong decision or something like that feels bad, but also inaccurate. Like it doesn't have to be that way. And if we're framing it that way, we're framing it wrong. So I hope that takes some of the pressure off, like this very pressured, very consequential decision, trying to make it as personal and as straightforward as possible.
All right. Thank you, Meghan, so much for joining us. We know you have to go, but we appreciate your time. So Josephine and I will jump into the last chapter, our wrap-up segment of the show, where we ask a library or bookish related question. And I thought I would ask today, what is a quote or a line from a book that's always stuck with you?
Ooh.
I know.
Oh man, this is sort of a non-answer, but I started having a bit of insomnia during pandemic, and what I found really, really helped was listening to Philip Pullman's Book of Dust to go to sleep, which is read by the Welsh actor Michael Sheen, and he has just this really soothing, really beautiful voice, and so I have this very kind of like waking dreaming relationship to that book, but it does. But I do know like parts of it verbatim. The gist of it is like it's two young people are having like a very dangerous adventure in a canoe in a flooded Oxford, England, on their way to London on the Thames. And this is not about a direct quote, but this is about a thing that sticks with me, and I'm often thinking about it as I fall asleep. So I'm often thinking of it as I wake up. The protagonist is a young boy named Malcolm, and Malcolm is learning like adult language and adult behaviors and all of this stuff just by watching, and I feel like his way of speaking and his way of thinking is so well captured by Philip Pullman. I feel like that is always very close to me at this point. It's been 3 or 4 years that I've been doing this pretty much every day. So I highly recommend that book for all readers, but also anyone who has occasional insomnia.
I also feel very similar to you that it's like, I remember the gist, but I very rarely remember like verbatim what is said in the books that I read.
Yeah. I find like I just don't do that well with like instant recall. Like I actually have a lot of quotes that sort of bop around in my head, but they only come up at like very specific circumstances where that memory is like, I don't have like full access. Like, same thing. Like if someone's like, what's your favorite band? I'm like, I've never listened to music before. I have no idea,
Yeah, but I do have kind of like a funny anecdote related to quotes from books. So my partner and I have been listening to The Expanse on audiobook, which is a 9-book sci-fi series. We just finished book 6, and there is one character. She is like the under vice secretary of the UN or whatever, the UN basically being like Earth's government. And she is this like foul-mouthed older Indian woman who like eats pistachios out of her purse. She is a very good politician, but she also, unlike I guess a lot of other politicians, she is not afraid to like say what the real, like very matter-of-factly and sometimes very crassly, like what the real situation actually is. And so I've said to my partner that I've been like, I feel like I need to keep a book of her quotes to just like go back to. None of which I could say on the podcast without bleeps, probably. But some of them were just like, it's almost like those books of like create your own swear phrases. Have you seen those in like Newbery Comics where it's like it's like that, like she makes her own crass expressions, but that are very apt for the situation at hand.
Yeah. No, I can very much appreciate that. While we were talking about this, this poet named John O'Donohue wrote a lot of poems that were like blessings for different situations. And there was this one, I do think about this all the damn time. He has a poem for people who are in grief or mourning or something like that. And he says, like, may you be excessively gentle with yourself. That might not even be the accurate line, but excessively gentle is like being excessively gentle with yourself is this phrase that I've been thinking about all year quite a lot. And it really resonated with me. There's something about the sort of extravagantness of it that like we talk about self-care, but there's this way in which self-care feels like it's just what needs to be done instead of sort of like lavishing yourself with care. So like a phrase that is often in my head is like, be excessively gentle with yourself. And I think that's like a really useful thing at the moment.
Yeah, that makes me think of one more thing for a book. Then we'll stop this. Cascade of that reminds me of. But one of my favorite graphic novel artists is Lucy Ninesley, and she wrote Kid Gloves, which was about her experience being pregnant with her first child. But leading up to that, she talks about some miscarriages that she experienced before conceiving her child. And I think it was her therapist that said, you have to treat yourself with kid gloves right now. And then that ended up being like the title for the book. But I sometimes I think about that as like really great therapist advice.
It's a beautiful way to put it.
Like in the context of what she was going through, like really great therapist advice, but also, like very applicable to just like, if you're really going through it, treat yourself like you're really going through it, you know?
Yeah. And it's, like how we behave with everybody else is such a mirror of how we're treating ourselves. So sometimes when we only leave like the littlest bit for ourselves, it really shows up everywhere. So there's lots of ways to say it. And it's such a foundational, it's simple, but not easy to do.
For sure. All right. So thank you for joining me, and thank you everyone for listening. If you'd like to respond to the last chapter question or just reach out to the show, you can send us an email at overdoingitpod@gmail.com, and that's overdoing it like all of the books at my house. Or you can find us on Instagram, same spelling, overdoing it pod. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend and rate and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, as it helps us reach more Rhode Islanders. Overdoing It is proud to be a resident partner of the Rhode Island Center for the Book and is brought to you by library staff and community members all across the Ocean State. The project has been funded in part by the Rhode Island Office of Library and Information Services. Thank you again for listening, and this has been another episode of Overdoing It, the Rhode Island Library Podcast. We're overdoing it, but you're doing just fine. Let's dive into and just